All right, hello and welcome everyone to the third and final webinar in our rotational no-till series titled Farmer Perspectives on Rotational No-Till Agriculture. My name is Sam Malriott. I'm the director of the Organic Consulting Program at the Rodale Institute, and I'll be hosting today's session once again with Leah Varek, our Midwest organic consultant and no-till cropping systems expert, currently based in Madison, Wisconsin. Our first two webinars in this series focused on setting the stage for rotational no-till, defining it, and diving deeper into how it applies to the term regenerative. But during today's webinar, we'll have the opportunity to hear from two farmers that have direct experience with these practices, Keith Speltz and Chris Wilson, both of whom I'll introduce in a minute. A few brief logistical items in case you missed the first two webinars. First, don't forget to keep checking our website for more webinars coming up this season. You can find more information and register at rodaleinstitute.org/education/webinars. There's no cost for attendance and all webinars are recorded for future viewing. So if for any reason you can't attend, you'll get emailed a link so you can watch it later. Second, if you're interested in attending our annual field day, it's taking place on July 22nd this year at our Kutztown, Pennsylvania campus. So come out and meet some people in the industry, learn about some of our research projects, and see what's new in organic agriculture. Third, and most importantly, I'm not sure how many people we have attending live, but please ask questions during today's webinar if you can. This is meant to be an interactive presentation, and if you're taking the time to join us, you should get everything you want out of this experience, so it's time well spent. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please write your inquiry only using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Try not to use the chat box for questions. They're a little more difficult for us to track. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and we'll generally answer them in the order they're received. And if you're experiencing any technical issues with this webinar, please call 610-683-1442 for assistance. I'll put that in the chat box now for your reference. And finally, I'd like to reintroduce Leah Varek to moderate our session, and our farmers, Keith Speltz and Chris Wilson. Keith is coming to us from Speltz Farms in Altura, Minnesota, and Chris joins us from Wilson Organic Farms near Cuba City, Wisconsin. I'll let them give some more background on their farms, but Leah, I'll pass it on to you to start us off with a few questions.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Thanks, Chris and Keith, for accepting to be here today. And yeah, I'm going to start. I guess this webinar is going to be structured. I'm going to ask Chris some questions about his about the Wilson farm operation, and I'm going to then ask Keith about his operation, and then we can ask questions to one another, take questions from the audience, so you have an understanding of what exactly we're talking about today. So Chris, you probably want to unmute yourself as I'm going to start asking you some questions. Again, thanks for coming. I've known Chris and his dad, Keith Wilson, for several years now, have done research on their farm. Amazing operation, probably the operation I know who has done organic no-till soybeans for the longest time, which is pretty exciting. So they definitely have many years under their belt of organic no-till soybeans and trying different tillage reduction strategies. So again, they're located in Cuba City, Wisconsin, which is the southwest corner of Wisconsin State. And I'm going to start asking Chris, because I know that their farm is pretty particular in that way, that there are several decision makers on the farm. So Chris, if you can describe the structure of who makes decisions, how many people work on the farm, and how that works out there.
Thanks, Leah, for the introduction. I lost a little bit of that in my internet connection there, but I'll just explain a little bit about our farm. We're located in southwest Wisconsin, near Cuba City. We're a multi-generation farm. We have about 3,400 acres that we touch in different ways. About 2,600 of that goes in the row crops, and I have two cousins that do a lot of they're the ones that do a lot of the day-to-day and really have a wealth of experience. They've farmed with my dad since I was a child. They're about 10, 15 years older than me. So they've been farming organically for 20 plus years now. And what they know is just unbelievable. And a lot of what I've tried to do as I've reconnected with the farm is try to, write down, catalog, and really document a lot of that knowledge, so that we can continue to find areas that maybe we can improve or replicate the successes that we do have, and then hopefully pass them on to future generations. And like Leah iterated, we worked with her for a number of years. Aaron Silva at O'Grain, and I can't remember what year maybe you started, Leah, but we've been no-till. We started trialing no-till soybeans in about 2010, somewhere in there. And we really kind of expounded on that and increased our acres quite a bit over the last 7 or 8 years in doing that.
Nice. Thanks, Chris. I think that was a good background of the farm. So again, 2,400 acres with dairy and some beef, was multi-generation working at the same time on the farm, which I find it's pretty unique. I don't work with a lot of growers who have that kind of setup. And if we want to go a little deeper in the crops that you grow and the cattle that you have, and how those two integrate, if you want to describe that a little bit for us, Chris.
Yeah, so we are primarily a dairy farm, but we also raise all of our replacement heifers, and then we have some beef production as well. So that animal is a component that the livestock is a huge variable in how we manage the farm and manage the cropping side. We do grow about 12 different types of crops, 7 grains and 5 forages, 5 unique forages that we raise. And with that, we have a lot of flexibility, I think, in setting up our rotations. And that's a really important factor, especially as we look at sort of reduced tillage and strategic tillage. That's been something that in the last 5 years that we put a lot of thought into, is how can we incorporate, especially in the forages, things that are non-traditional that allow us to if we are going to use tillage, use it strategically, and try to reduce the intensity, or the certain times of the year in which there's potentially more risk for soil erosion, because we do have a lot of, I wouldn't say steep grades, but a lot of 4 to 8% graded land, sloped land, a lot of B grade ground. So it's that placement and making sure that we don't have exposure in the spring, especially, but also in that fall window where it's completely exposed on hillsides is really important to us. So it's something that we put a lot of time and effort into.
Yeah, so as you first said, like you're a dairy first, so that's kind of how it all started. And so if you want to segue back to like those number of crops that you said you're growing, and how like the dairy has allowed you to grow those crops, or how some of those crops perhaps you're growing for selling outside the farm, if you want to go into more details in listing the crops that you grow. Yeah,
so we do farm on the acres that we farm. It ranges in different distances from the farm. The majority of it was within distance in which where we can use dairy manure, and that has different rotations and different impacts, especially as we get ground that's able to have more fertility from that over time. We grow, our primary rotation has a grass alfalfa mix, in which we try to keep that and manage that stand for longevity, and then ultimately that will get turned into generally a corn crop, and then from there it gets interesting depending on what contour strip may be around it and how that looks like over time, what the manure access is, and so from there we'll generally either go into like a winter barley or a winter wheat, hard red, soft red, and then then have that flexibility to also potentially go into like a rolled rye from there. So then after that, if we go, a lot of times we'll go that small grain direction. Some years we'll turn around and cover crop that right after wheat. A lot of times we're like this last couple of years, we're starting to frost seed into those small grains, and then leave that basically in that clover is what we red clover frost seeded. We'll leave that in, sometimes take a cutting in the fall, and then do corn again. If we don't have as much fertility, then we will look to go from that small grain into like a rye cover crop that's planted earlier, so that we have a really good mulch for then planting in the no-till soybeans next spring. And then from there, typically when we get the soybeans, a lot of times we'll turn the rotation over back into alfalfa. But we can do the small grain thing that stretches it out often 2 or 3 years in that rotation. And a lot of the tillage in there is a lot less intensive than the most intensive point that we have is from alfalfa into that corn crop and the manure that goes with it.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's a solid 5 to 7 year rotation here. That's pretty good. So
Yep.
I guess I'm gonna kind of change the trajectory that I initially intended to take, and I'm gonna go and ask Keith all those background questions, so we have the background on those farms before we dig deeper into the tillage and the tillage reduction. So Keith, if you want to unmute yourself. Okay, well, maybe I'm just gonna continue with you, Chris, if Keith is just not having issues unmuting himself here. Okay, Keith, we're gonna give you another 5-10 minutes to unmute yourself, and we're gonna go into more question and the tillage reduction on the farm at the Wilson Dairy Farm.
Yeah, and Keith can jump in whenever he wants. And
yeah, we're gonna see when the unmute button shows up.
Yeah. As soon as you figure that out, Keith, feel free to jump in. We'll get some background from you and then go from there.
Yeah, yep. Tell us that you're here. Okay, so I guess kind of now like segueing into the tillage reduction question. So we kind of have an idea of what you grow and why you grow it and the animals on the farm.
You don't want to mute it.
there he is.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, hey.
Oh, hi. I've been watching, just trying to figure this technology out.
Yay. We hear you,
Keith-
Keith, now.
Okay, Keith Speltz from Altura, Minnesota, in the southeast part of the state. I've been organic for about 6 years. So my crop rotation is wheat, winter rye, no-till soybeans, corn, and then back to wheat again. I'm trying to figure out how to get a legume of some sort in there, but I have not been able to figure that out yet. We're experimenting with different crops all the time, trying to figure this thing out. So that's about it.
So how many acres are you farming on?
We're farming about 500 acres. I do have cattle. I have 35 beef cows, but I'm also a former dairy farmer, so I have all kinds of buildings. So we have dry cows and heifers here, some goats, and I do have access to manure from my cousin that has a large dairy. So after the wheat, they like to come and spread manure on my farm after wheat also.
And is that okay? Is that all the manure that you use is from your cousin's dairy?
Well, yes, and my own from the dry cows and heifers that are here, and from my beef cattle, yes.
Okay. And you asked me about that actually last week about cattle integration into the crop rotation. So have you done any of that? Are you planning to do any of it?
Well, I'm still trying to figure it out. I have, with me previously having a dairy, so I have a lot of cement. So the cows don't have to be in the mud in the spring. and everything. So I can keep them locked in on cement till the grass greens up before we kick them out to pasture and stuff, which helps tremendously. So eventually we'll work it into the system of grazing, but it's going to take some time.
Okay. And as we're touching on that, Chris, if you want to touch on your livestock integration into the crops, I know that you had a field day last year on the tumble wheel. And have you used that just on pastures, or are you planning to use that like to integrate cows on field crops if you want to touch on livestock integration?
Yep. So that's probably the area that I've gotten most involved with on the farm. I came back around 2017 and have been more involved each year, but the grazing side, we went from a paddock-based system to adaptively grazing on our grazing acres. Organic dairy, we have those grazing requirements. We've grazed pretty much even prior to being organic. We were a rotational grazer, so that was all fairly seamless. But we went to adaptive grazing so that we could keep cattle basically on one spot for a day or less, and instead of for a week at a time. And that in itself is been just an awesome change for a lot of reasons. But what Leia's referring to is we use what's called a tumble wheel system, which is basically these wheels that one person can go out and walk the fence line across the pasture in basically 20-30 minutes, change a lot. And what we haven't done as much of, or really hardly at all, is integrating grazing into our cropping. And that is something that this year I've got 2 field locations that I'm hoping to that have decent perimeter fences, and I'm going to go basically set up these tumble wheels and graze the cover crop post wheat and give that. I know that there's some benefits, or I know that there's a lot of opportunity there that we're not capturing, and I'm excited to kind of add that as another kind of a leg, and the tumble wheels will definitely be a part of that.
Awesome. If you go ahead.
Very, very briefly, for those of our listeners that may not be familiar with it, would you mind just explaining how a tumble wheel works and how it's maybe different than other things you could use?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with moving fences in a grazing system, a lot of times you're using pigtail fence posts or step-in fence posts that you step in every, say, 60 feet, 80 feet. And then you got your temp wire. We use turbo wire, and you'll run that spiel out, or if you can drag it sideways and repost them, that's a lot of times what you'll do. In our system, basically, we have these wheels that have 3 foot legs that stick out each side, and it's like a spoke. So basically you're seeing the hard spokes that come out from the center, and then the wire runs through an insulated core that is designed that as it rolls, basically the wire stays hot, and it will keep the top legs hot, but not the bottom legs. And basically, instead of having to move those posts each time, the wheel, as you can imagine, is basically just like a wheel, and it just rolls across that landscape. And that eliminates the pulling and replacing of fence posts. And it takes it probably saves us 3 or 4 times. It says it being an hour and a half job, an hour job, it's probably a 20-30 minute job to move a paddock. And that's just huge. I mean,
Yeah, it does sound huge.
yeah, they're Gallagher tumble wheels. There's a whole bunch of videos online if you want to check them out. But we definitely would. We're not affiliated, but I definitely would endorse them. I mean, they're an awesome tool.
Yeah, it's always good to know farmers who've tried things and like it or not.
Yeah.
Great.
And
So
I think
Yeah.
like imagining in the cropping system, what we're hoping to do is have that wheat that we take off, go in, and typically we'll if we have manure, we'll spread that and then cover crop. But we also have on this ground specifically, we won't have any manure to apply, so we'll go ahead and we're gonna just no-till in the cover crop and let that grow up. And probably the goal is to extend our grazing on our heifers and beef cattle feeders and finished steers. Extend that out into November, maybe into December, whereas typically our pasture grazing season is winding down by mid-October.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, if you both want to stay unmuted, that will make it easier. I think you both are unmuted now. So Keith, you said you've been organic for 6 years, and so assuming before that you were farming conventionally, you said you were a dairyman. Were you also growing crop, and were you doing that no-till, or how did the no-till idea come to you as an organic grower?
Well, we were a conventional dairy, so all we basically raised was just corn and alfalfa. All the alfalfa went to the cattle. Corn was half corn silage, half grain. So then when we switched to organic, the first year I cultivated beans and it didn't go very well. And I said, never again. So I've tried the spring seeded rye with no-till beans. I've seen very good success with it, and I've seen failures. I think the more consistent approach is to get a rotation where you can get a small grain in the rotation, get that off, so you can get your winter rye planted by September 1st and do the roll crimp soybean method for no-till. I'm sold 100% on that. So that's the only way I'll do my beans right now. And we're trying to get the corn thing figured out. I'm glad other people are experimenting with it. I'm also experimenting with it. We'll eventually get there. So
That's the attitude. So what did you not like about, what did you throw the towel on tilled soybeans?
Just it's so difficult to get that cultivator set and to get it ridged. I don't know. I just don't like cultivating. I mean, I don't mind doing the cultivating part, but to do a good job, it's time consuming getting the cultivator set. So, and then to have multiple cultivators, because it depends how high the crop is. And so I just would prefer not to have to cultivate. So that's why I like the no-till soybeans. And I think all the organic matter from the winter rye that gets worked into the ground the next year is very good for the soil. My soils are probably a 1 to 3% organic matter, maybe some at 3.5. So we're really trying to raise that organic matter of the soil to help the crops and help the soil health and everything. So we don't always take the straw off from the wheat. Sometimes we just work it right into the soil when we're working in that manure before we plant the rye, also trying to build soil organic matter.
And you also grow corn. Are you more comfortable cultivating corn, or you're just growing it because to be honest, it's still kind of a big money maker in the Midwest, and you just cultivate it because you kind of have to? Are you spacing out your corn because you don't like to cultivate?
Well, corn is king, from the cash standpoint. Yes. I mean, I have my mistakes cultivating corn too. Last year it went from 80 bushel to 200 bushel. I had 60 acres that averaged 200 bushel. So I know it can be done. And that was after we chopped rye off for forage for, the neighbor took it for the dry cows and heifers. So I know we can grow 200 bushel corn, and everything just, I guess the stars aligned and that worked out very well. So if we can do that consistently year after year, I'd be happy, but it's a challenge to get there.
Yep, the weather does not always cooperate either. So what have you tried with organic no-till corn?
So we tried the spring seeded rye, you know, if it works for beans, well, let's try it for corn. Total disaster, but there's only a couple 100 yards. It wasn't, you know, very much, but I tried it twice. I tried it a third time when the product Weed Slayer was available. The corn, we sprayed Weed Slayer to kill the winter rye, killed it perfectly. The corn got up to about 8 inches tall, and the army worms decimated that 8-acre field. They ate it to the ground before I caught it. So that was a learning curve there that we had. So we're gonna try some clover, some white Dutch clover planted this spring, and I'm hoping to no-till corn into it next year. I'm gonna try flaming a path where the corn's gonna go. We'll see how that works. So I'll also try some spring seeded clovers. There's 3 different clovers in there and alfalfa. So I'm going to plant corn, and then the next day go over there with a brilliant seeder and seed the alfalfa, see if that will really reduce the weed pressure. Even if I have to go in there later and just maybe get by just cultivating it once. We're going to try that, see what happens there. So that's my plans for this year and next year.
That's why I like to catch up with you every year, because you're always innovating. There is always something new on your farm. That's always fun. So I just wanted to clarify for people who may not be familiar, there are 2 things that you mentioned. So first one is the spring rye. So when you say that, you say you've tried with the soybeans and with the corn. So that system is when, so rye needs to vernalize in order to go through reproductive stages, which means it needs to be exposed to cold temperatures for a certain period of time. And with the spring rye system, we're planting rye after the temperature have already warmed up. So the rye will not be exposed to those cold temperatures, and it will stay vegetative, which means it would stay really grassy, like a lawn, like a golf course, like a football stadium, whatever you want to think about grass. And it will never grow taller than that. And so it has worked in some instances to plant the rye at the same time as the soybeans, a couple days before the soybeans, and let them grow together, maybe do a little bit tine weeding. And on some farms, some years, it has worked. It's a pretty hit or miss system, as kind of Keith highlighted it. You know, it's worked some places, some years, it hasn't worked other places, other years. And I could see how, like, with the competition with the corn and being a grass as well, it would be a little different with corn. And the other thing that you mentioned was Weed Slayer. So Weed Slayer was an RMRI, so organic approved herbicide that was actually withdrawn from the market recently. Yeah, so you just name drop Weed Slayer. It's just a name brand from a herbicide that used to be RMRI approved, but no longer exists actually. Yeah, so great. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm going to switch over to you, Chris. So a little bit of a different story here, where you didn't mention that, but can you mention the history of, like, the organic transition? You've been in organic for a very long time, and then add to that the history of, like, reducing tillage into systems.
Sure. Yeah, so our farm transitioned in 99. So we've been organic for 23 years, selling organic milk since 2000. So we have that history. I think we've always incorporated sort of rotations, and we've typically grown organically. Your corn, your soybeans, and your alfalfa are the main 3 crops that we've got that history growing. I think the really going down the path of reduced tillage was working with Aaron and Leah at O'Grain, and starting to incorporate rolled rye, no-till soybeans into the rotation instead of the cultivated soybeans. And I think we started somewhere around 2010, 2012 was the first trials that we ran on our farm. And we, at the time it was maybe 5-10 acres, and we had some early success, which is always great when you're trying something new. And kind of from that, we've certainly built it out. And I think, like, last year was a great example where 60% of our soybean acres were no-till organic soybeans in the rolled rye. So that was a huge success. And what we've seen is that the ground in which we've been able to consistently have that rotation and just taking out even just that 1 year of intensive tillage in the system has really netted some pretty big jumps in our organic matter in those locations. And they're already inherently, which I'd like to maybe hit on that part. They were already blessed with some pretty good fertility because they had access to dairy manure. They've been in a long-term organic diversified crop rotation. So they had already been, a lot of our ground in our area range from 2 to 3.5% generally on organic matter. And these farms a decade ago were probably around 3%, and now they're 4 to 4.5% organic matter. And farms that maybe we haven't been able to get as much no-till rye into, they tend to flatline out a bit more in the 3s. So I think that's been a huge testament to that. And I think we've seen the successes sort of like build on themselves from there. We started implementing, I would say, less intensive tillage probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And then a lot of our manure applications too, we're trying to place them at the right time and ideally get cover crops in right after them when we do that tillage to make sure that we've got a root system, especially over those winter months and in the spring. That's been mainly on the soybean side. And I think we've learned a lot about the soybeans, and Leah, you can let me know how much you want me to dive into that and when, but I guess on the corn side, it's really interesting to listen to Keith and what he's doing. We haven't tried no-till corn on our farm. I was hopeful that we would this year. Our biggest challenge has been on the setup into that, and a lot of our corn generally will be planted after alfalfa. And we're getting more rotations now where we've got opportunity to no-till or get that clover established into wheat. And I was really hopeful this year that we would have some ground that we put manure on after wheat. We put a clover, tillage radish, oat mix in, and it looked really good last fall. Had a really good cover on it. And I probably made the mistake of not taking off the biomass in the fall because the oats were, waist high, and that ended up smothering a lot of patches of the clover. So unfortunately, we're not going to have that. I was hoping to run a test trial on no-till corn into that, similar to what Keith was iterating, where we'd maybe try flaming a row. We were working with All Grain a bit on that as far as what the exact prescription was going to be, but won't be this year. I'm hoping maybe next year to create the same setup, but do a better job on managing that cover crop so that it's mainly just that clover coming through in the spring, and having a really good thick mat of it, I think is going to be really important for it to be successful.
Yeah,
and
I go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes we're constantly always pushing those, areas too, what we can try and see if it works. And we've got a few other things we're doing, but I think one thing that we've kind of learned is to know when to kind of punt on an experiment, or know when to pull the plug on the rye for the no-till rye versus sticking with it, and try to, you're never going to eliminate all your failures, but try to strategically, make sure that you're setting yourself up for as many wins as possible.
Yep. I mean, I yet have to find another farm that has being every year trying or doing several acres of organic no-till soybeans for more than 10 years. I think it's pretty unique, the situation you're in. So it's really nice. And I think I kind of want to separate those two aspects of it. So addressing, no-till crops, like planting soybeans in no-till in roll down rye, or planting corn in clover. Those are very like extreme systems that we're really planting a crop in a mulch. But then if we want to address like reducing tillage at the rotation scale in every single aspect of every crop you plant, including your wheat, your solid planted crops, including terminating your alfalfa. So if you want to touch on all those like, little tweaks that you've been making in the rotation to reduce tillage, and also why you've been doing that.
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of what we looked at with our farm is that, if the weather lines up perfect, we can probably grow a lot of corn and soybeans and culture, et cetera. So a big component of what we looked at is really the economic side of that formula for us. And that includes not just the bottom line, but like the human aspect of that economics, how much labor, how much time, how much stress there is throughout that production season. So we've really looked at ways to, eliminate as much tillage as we can, because it's just not that many passes across the field. So that's been a driver. And then obviously the soil benefits from that are a big factor as well to try to drive that. And so what we've looked at is really trying to stretch out our rotations as much as we can. I think for us, we're blessed with having the livestock that we can run forages through. So a lot of our goal is to make sure we get a really good hay stand established, and then try to keep that in a perennial as long as we can and manage that way, because you're not tilling the ground all those years. So if we can keep it in 3-4 years, we consider that a success. And then when it does come out, typically we have that corn year, and that tillage is usually the most intense within our rotation. So we are trying to manage that depending on where the manure is, when the manure's got to go on. We like to make sure that manure is incorporated. So if we can inject it surface and keep that hay crop in place through spring and terminate that in early May, that's the ultimate goal. So that timing, again, to try to keep that ground cover as long as we can through the spring. And then from there, if we get that termination early enough, a lot of times we're looking at fairly light passes then through the rest of the rotation. So a lot of times we will use an intensive tillage to terminate that alfalfa and deal with any compaction that we may have. So we'll run a deeper disc ripper. But then from there, we have our corn crop. We are growing shorter maturity corn. So typically we can grow 105, 110 day corn in our area. Typically I'm trying to plant 95 to 103, 104 day silage corn. And my goal is to try to be doing corn silage on our farm by the 10th of September every year, and sooner is better. And then doing high moisture or snaplage by that third week of September, and then doing some shell corn wherever possible by that first week of October. And what that allows us to do then is to get our small grains in, and get those small grains in, whether it's a no-till or whether it's rye for no-till soybeans or wheat. And then if it's wheat, then that sets up our future rotations where if we get that wheat established, it looks good, we'll go in and frost seed clover if it's a non-manure based location. And then that carries through basically a whole nother year. We take the wheat off, we leave the wheat stands. Sometimes we may chop it, sometimes we won't. Most of the time we won't, because we don't need it in those locations. So we leave the biomass and just let it go through in the spring. And then clover is a super mellow tillage crop. So we just use a vertical till unit that's maybe running 2-3 inches deep, and lay that down and plant corn into it. Usually we'll also, at that point, we'll haul some manure usually in the spring onto that ground, and then incorporate it, I guess, with that VT unit. If it happens to need a second pass, then we would. But in the past, we would have probably chisel plowed all that, or, you know, a lot of times it would have been soybeans, and it would have been, you know, maybe a spring cover crop after that corn that got harvested in November, because it was later maturity. So shortening up that corn hybrid really helps, I think, a lot in getting stuff in the fall for us in the right time. The other component that we're seeing a lot of is that the ground fertility really drives a lot of our rotation decisions. So if we've got ground that we have, you know, a really good base, access to manure, nitrogen credits maybe from 2 years prior on alfalfa, the prior year on manure applications that went into corn, you can get some just beautiful stands of rye from that. But if we've got some, you know, poor ground, that rye stand, even if you get it in by the end of September, it just doesn't seem to have the same punch, and that opens up to a lot of weed problems then the following spring. So that ground tends to be more of something that we push into a small grain instead of doing the no-till rye on. And then that allows us then to do that frost seeding into that ground, the clover, and playing it out that way. So it's all those little things along the way. And then, like I said before, once we get that wheat, if we have that, if we have wheat that we'd like to push into beans, then we can, on that poor ground, that's usually a good candidate that we can, like as Keith said, he's doing after wheat. We're doing the same thing where we'll plant that rye September 1st or even late August if it's eligible, and just let it go. You know, at that point, we're not worried about diseases necessarily in the rye. We just want it to get up and go on and create a cover and prevent really those spring grasses from getting established is really the big culprit that we fight in our rolled rye. The broadleafs and the stuff that gets up above the beans, we don't worry about. We typically, from a weed management standpoint, if we have a taller broadleaf, we use a zapper that we run across the fields twice to clean those up. And our biggest challenge is really that the grass, you know, the grass pressures that might come up through that rye in the spring and early summer.
Nice. Yeah, it's all those little strategies for at every time of the rotation, but also like making room for that no-till phase in the rotation are two really critical aspects that I kind of gathered from what you said here. So Keith, you don't have alfalfa, which is a good and a bad thing, because as we heard, alfalfa can be very tillage demanding to terminate it, but it's also a really good crop to suppress weed and build soil and build soil nutrient sort of structure. So what's it seems like corn would be the most intensive tillage demanding phase of your rotation. How have you been decreasing tillage at the rotation scale? And also, like, do you wish you still had alfalfa in your rotation?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yes, I do have some alfalfa in the rotation, just not as much, you know. It's probably 50 acres, 30 to 50 acres of alfalfa that we do have. And to the point of reducing tillage, I only use the chisel plow to help compaction where we have to haul manure and you make a road through the field to get to the field or whatever. I switched to the lumpkin disc, and that's my main tillage tool to only work the ground 4 to 5 inches deep at the most. And that works in all my cover crops. And that is my main tillage tool for working everything. It'll terminate the alfalfa, and it will terminate my rye. So I also would like to plant oats before my corn, like in the soybean ground, going from soybeans to corn. It's too late this year, but last year I had my oats planted and it was up already. So I really like to get a cover crop, a green cover crop of oats or wheat into that soybean ground, just to get, even if it's only 2-3 inches tall, that's all right. There's enough going on below the soil to help that corn crop. So I really like, if I can and have the time to do it, to get a cover crop in, even if it's only for 45 days before that corn crop. I think it really helps.
Yeah, I was visiting another farm in Wisconsin who was mentioning planting oats and peas in the spring before corn, which I always thought that, maybe they're just, I don't know if it's enough bang for the bucks, like having that seed cost and putting it in the ground to get only a few inches, but it's good to hear that you find it really valuable to do that.
So I have a question that came in here from one of our attendees. Thanks, Rick, for submitting that. And like we've talked about in our previous webinars, there are a lot of practices you can implement to sort of earn the right to till. And some of those, I mean, you're doing all of them, Chris and Keith. That's cover cropping, crop rotation, adding manure, and reducing tillage. All of those are really important components of building soil health, and that allows us to till a little bit more sometimes. So one of those practices is the application of manure or grazing. So Rick's question is, where in the rotation do you add manure, and how many times in the 5 to 7 years? So if you could both answer, we'll start with Chris. Where in the rotation do you add manure, and how many years out of the total years of your rotation are you doing that?
Sure. So we always add manure before going into a corn crop. So that's probably the general rule. And then we will sometimes add manure if it's going into a small grain, depending on how many nitrogen credits we feel like we have, and then timing and everything else. If we feel like the manure application is going to push our planting day on the small grain back too far into October, then we won't do it, because the trade-off just isn't there. And then we'll also apply manure as we head into reestablishing alfalfa, which typically we'll have a small grain companion crop that we take as forage with that. So in a 7-year rotation, typically 3 to 4 times we'll add manure, or 3 to 4 of the years we'll have manure incorporated in it.
That's great. Yeah, thanks so much. And same question for you, Keith. When are you adding manure in your rotation over the course of the entire thing?
Okay, so after the wheat, we're adding manure, and it's top spread, not injected, because they like to bring it with semis because it's coming from a few miles away. So they're just top spreading it into the wheat fields. And then after the soybeans, I like to knife in manure to get ready for corn for the following year. And sometimes when we take the winter rye off as a forage, and where that's going into manure, we also knife in manure at that time. So probably at least 2 out of 4 years, sometimes 3 out of 4, it's getting manure, just because I have access to the manure.
And I guess kind of staying on that conversation with the manure application. So Keith, since you have like the beef cows and the dairy manure, I'm assuming like beef cows is like bedding pack, so it's solid, and dairy you could inject or knife in. Do you feel like using manure, because it's your only source of nutrients as an organic farmer, is a limitation to reducing tillage? And how have you tried to like adapt that, or like, reduce tillage in the manure application?
That's very difficult to do with the type of manure we're dealing with. With the liquid manure from the dairies, it has a lot of water in it. Typically, it's only 8 to 10 pounds of N per 1,000 gallons. So you have to put quite a bit on. The dairy or the manure from the beef cows is not so much bedding pack as it is just like a daily scrape and haul out of the barn. So that's just getting top spread and worked into the ground.
And Chris, same, like, have you I'm sure you've thought about it. So have you thought about how to like keep manure but reduce tillage? We know we have to work it in, or we lose nutrients. I'm sure it's like not a fun like decision to make. And how do you make it?
Yeah, no, it's there's trade-offs, and I think that's always something that we're not like, acknowledging that there's a trade-off to each thing, and manure is a great asset. The fall applied manure from the dairy is probably the most challenging. If I can get it knifed in, great. But if I have to top spread it, because it's a lot of times it may be on a contour where there's 2 crops and I just the strips are too narrow to knife, I will incorporate that in the fall, because I don't want the nutrients running off and creating downstream problems for everything else. So that's the one time that we do. I think the things that we've tried to do is we have that 7-year rotation. A lot of what I look at is okay, what am I using in that 7 years, and what am I putting back on, and where are we building, or are we holding, those things, and then trying to line up the N with the crop that as much as we can, because usually we have too much N overall in the big picture, growing as many legumes and having the livestock. But so there's that side. On the bedding pack, one of the things that we've started to do more is use that as top dressing on our pastures. And really, if we can leave a really nice big thatch of grass in those pastures, and go in and just really lightly take that bedding pack and spread it across it, it's a really nice fertilizer for those pasture systems. And we feel pretty good about not having a lot of runoff and loss from that. We do typically try to do that when it's cold out and you're going to mess up those pastures. The ground's usually frozen, or kind of going frozen to off type periods. But again, we got to set those pastures up so that you're leaving a lot of brown material out there, so that it's not going to run off with the rain or anything. And super lightly. So we've been doing that with some of our bedding pack. And of course, those pastures are no-till environments. And then similar on sort of the post-wheat ground, instead of just assuming that we're going to till that, go spread manure and till it in, if we can get that cover crop established, we'll just spread manure on top of the cover crop lightly in the spring, in the summer when we're growing it. And or usually it's like late August when that clover's had a chance to get up and get some legs to it. You go ahead and spread it real lightly. It will knock some of it out, but the vast majority of it holds in there, and then we'll re-spread it in the spring before we terminate that clover. And again, that cuts out that tillage pass after you take the weed off.
So thanks so much, Chris and Keith. That's great. And really helpful to kind of see where that fits in. It's interesting. A lot of the conventional farmers we're working with they're applying nitrogen every year. So to hear that, these applications are sometimes only about half of the years that you're in your rotation, that's pretty impressive. It means you do have a lot of innate soil fertility, and that's exciting stuff. So I do have we only have about 5 minutes here left, and I want to make sure if any of our attendees are interested in asking any questions, please do submit those in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get them in before we finish up here. But my last question for you both was, do you think that tillage has a place in organic row crop production going forward? If you could kind of look into the future and say, are we going to reduce tillage? Will it still have a place in our rotation? How do you see that working out? And you can give the short-term view, let's say the next 5 to 10 years, and the long-term, maybe in 30 years. But this is a debate that we have a lot with farmers, is surrounding tillage and its ability to foster healthy soil. Because Chris, like you mentioned, there are trade-offs with all of these practices. We know that tillage can incorporate residue, but it can also erode soil and break its structure. So I'm just interested to hear both of your opinions on that, and we'll start with Keith. Do you think tillage has a place in organic production in the future?
Oh, sure it does. I mean, and it's a fine line between, should we till or not, but you have to still control your weed seed bank so it doesn't get out of control. We've learned that shallow tillage is okay, 2, 3, 4 inches is fine versus the 6, 7, 8 of the deep chisel plow and the moldboard plow. So there is going to still be a place for tillage, and if we can minimize it, that's really good. And it's ongoing learning thing. We the universities and the Rodale Institute, you're teaching us things by doing this research, which is great. And we're learning things all the time. So I think there is a place for some tillage, and it depends, how do you get that manure incorporated. I have friends that have been no-tillers for 20 years. They're on some steeper hills, and they do a wonderful job on managing their hay and their corn and stuff. So it's a challenge, and there is room for the no-till, but there is also times that we have to have tillage, just to work the volume of residue that is left into the ground and to build your organic soil matter. So I think there will always be some tillage, but if we can minimize it, that's good. It's a challenge, but we're trying to, and what we're learning is improving the soil structure, the microbes in the soil. We don't know everything that's going on, and we're getting educated about it all the time. And I think that's a good thing.
Perfect. Thanks, Keith. Same question to you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what Keith iterated. I mean, I think, being in Sphere, you're always trying to innovate and push the boundaries, but it's hard for us to imagine completely eliminating tillage within an organic system, and especially one that has a fairly high volume of manure as its primary fertilizer component. I think there's certainly, some no-till organic farmers out there that are pushing those boundaries and creating some systems that are predominantly no-till, and that's awesome. I think the manure component is definitely one for us that adds that extra wrinkle that's hard to overcome, and push the zero tillage within a rotation. I think the other aspect too is, I'm hopeful, that maybe over my lifetime that we start to reperennialize the ground some more. And I think crop rotations are definitely, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and I think grabbing those now is great and pushing those. But I think the more that we can get away from, the corn bean mindset of that row crop and push towards perennialization and that diversified landscape, that to me would be a 20+ year vision that I would love to see, and would be hopeful that maybe we can start to reorient in that direction within my lifetime.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. I have to say, I asked that question without having any idea what the answer might be. We really value people's objective opinion, and that we couldn't really agree more with both of those opinions, because it's a big debate in the ag community right now surrounding tillage, and I think both of your approaches is spot on. So thanks so much for sharing that. We did have one more question that came into the Q&A box, again from Rick. So maybe both of you could just touch on this briefly, but he asks, can you explain the economic trade-offs in length of time you keep alfalfa in the rotation? Wondering why you don't keep the alfalfa longer. I'm assuming you're haying the ground and or grazing it.
Yeah, you want me to take this? Yeah, that's a great question. I think the big picture for us is that hay has that reputation of is very nutrient intensive, especially when you're looking at potassium and to lesser extent phosphorus. So you're taking we hay the ground and we take it back to dairy and feed it to the cattle, and that nutrient lift from that hay is substantial. So part of the nice thing is if you can push your rotation out to seven years and have that manure applied 3 or 4 of those years, strategically, is that you're effectively building back that nutrient that you took off the ground. So if you leave it in alfalfa longer than say 3 or 4 years, you can do that, but you kind of got to try to stretch the back end of that rotation back out even further so that you're getting more of those manure applications at the right time and not all at once, so that you're maintaining those nutrient levels for that hay crop that's there, and not having to basically buy in those nutrients.
Perfect. That's great. And Keith, I know you've reduced the alfalfa acreage a little bit, but how long are you generally keeping it on? And
Well, yes, I'm going about the seeding year and 2 or 3 more years, you know, so about 3 to 4 years. And it just depends the location of the fields where they're at. On some hills and contours, I'll purposely seed it down into alfalfa just from an erosion standpoint. So we're 3 to 4 years.
I also want to add to that alfalfa is self-toxic. I don't know what the perfect term for that, but you know, bigger alfalfa plant will not let smaller alfalfa seedling establish because it is self-toxic like that. So leaving alfalfa on the long term will actually lead to like a very thin stand of alfalfa with dying old plants and small plants that don't really want to take over. So you would have to like perpetually like, I don't know how you would even build it, like add grass to it, but that's definitely like probably one of the driving of like, why would you not leave alfalfa on forever?
Yeah, that's a great point. So we are coming to the end of our time here, of our hour together. I wish I could stay for another hour because this is great. And we learn a lot just by talking with farmers. Hey, there's so much going on out there that's innovative and that's constantly pushing the envelope that really hasn't even made it into the university system or to Rodale. So I honestly think that the most important research is happening on farms, because both of you know your soil so well and your landscape and how you can fit these practices into your rotation. I think it's fascinating. So thank you so much. I'll just go ahead and close it out. I'd like to thank our attendees for taking the time out of your day to engage with us and for the questions you had. Thanks again to those of you that are using some of these practices on your farms and helping to educate others about organic and regenerative organic ag. And special thanks, of course, to Keith and Chris for taking valuable time out of their day to inject some reality and perspective into the discussion. We know it's a busy time of year, so we appreciate your time immensely. Again, please keep an eye on our website to register for any webinars that might be of interest to you. And I'll put up this slide just briefly, but if you're a farmer or landowner that is interested in utilizing some of our consulting services, putting our information up on a slide right here. You can call either me or Leah or call our direct consulting line at 610-683-1400, or sorry, 1416. And those are our direct lines right there. You can also visit our website, rotaleinstitute.org/consulting, to get a little more information about what we offer. So thanks so much again, and have a wonderful day.